Okay, let's begin. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining in on this, the third episode of Zoroastrian Conversations. This was a series that came about from a dialogue with Professor Yuhan Vevaina, who's been a great friend at Vevaina and also personally, and we discussed this idea of we hear about amazing scholars of the religion, but we sometimes, and we know what they're studying, but we sometimes don't know more about themselves and their individual and personal leanings as to why they took up the study of Zoroastrianism and all of that. So that kind of evolved over a couple of conversations, and Johan said, let's do this series. So this series came about that way, and this is the third episode, and I'm really happy that Dr. Céline Redard is joining us today. Just one housekeeping announcement: all Q&A will be through the chat as normal. So if you have your questions, during the talk or later on, just put them in the chat, and Johan or I will moderate them and kind of call them out. With that, it's over to Johan.
All right. So, can you all hear me? Yes? Okay, great. So, thank you all for logging in today for the third interview of the Zoroastrian Conversations hosted by Vevaina. So, I'm Yuhan Vevaina, the Bahari Associate Professor of Sasanian Studies and a Fellow of Wolfson College at the University of Oxford in the UK. So, before we begin, I would like to thank Arzan. We had this idea a while back, and I'm very, very glad that we've been able to put it into practice, and we've had some good numbers, and I'm very excited to be able to continue to do this. So, one of the basic ideas of doing this was that I wanted to be able to introduce people not just to the cutting edge research that gets published, but also the people behind the research. And so you can have a better feeling for who they are, what they do, and in a sense, sort of what motivates them and makes them tick. And so we have one such person whom I feel is most deserving of being an interviewee for us. She's a newly appointed scholar to a permanent job in our field, which is not something that happens every day. And so let me introduce Dr. Céline Redard. She has taken up her post as a lecturer for the Institute of History of Religions at the University of Strasbourg in France. And before specializing in Iranian studies, Céline studied Indo-European linguistics, Sanskrit, and Latin at the University of Neuchâtel in Switzerland, her home country. So in 2010, she obtained her PhD at the École Pratique des Hautes Études in Paris, with her doctoral thesis being an edition, translation, and commentary on Vidēvdād 19. And after working as a research assistant at the Collège de France in Paris from 2008 to 2014, she was awarded a very prestigious Marie Curie Fellowship at the University of Liège in Belgium, and she was there from 2014 to 2016. And during that time, she concentrated her research on the link between the so-called long liturgy, which she can tell you a little bit more about, and the shorter liturgies. And then from 2017 to 2022, she worked as a postdoctoral researcher attached to the Multimedia Yasna project, funded by the European Research Council and directed by Professor Almut Hintze at SOAS in London, so with us here in the UK. And then last year, she was attached to the University of Strasbourg as a researcher, where she continued her research on the Gujarati ritual directions in the manuscripts, with the aim to study the transmission of the Zoroastrian rituals in India from the 16th century until today. So in an interesting way, Céline has a very, very broad, she works in a very broad time period, as many of us, but really she has work that sort of goes all the way back to the beginnings of Zoroastrianism and all the way into the early modern period and the sort of the closer to the contemporary as well. So before we get going, I should add that Céline had a phenomenal year of publishing in 2021 with 4, and I repeat, 4 works that will be used by us as fundamental works for many years to come. So she co-authored an introduction to the Avestan in French with Professor Jean Kellens, who's now emeritus from the Collège de France. And she also co-authored the Gujarati ritual directions of the Paragna, Yasna, and Vispred ceremonies with Kerman Daruvala. And Céline also published in that same year the Zoroastrian Yasna 3 to 8, a critical edition with ritual commentaries and glossary. And last but not least, a philological study of Vidēvdād 19 in French on the story of Zarathustra's victory over Angra Mainyu. And so with that, let us kick off. So, Céline, thank you so much for agreeing to do this.
Thank you for inviting me. I am very honored. I never expected such an honor, so thank you.
I don't know about the honor, but definitely the privilege is all ours. So it's sort of the same question that I more or less begin with, because I think, it's always good to start at the beginning of things. So tell us a little bit about who you are, where you're from, and how you got interested in and then involved with the study of Zoroastrianism.
Well, I think you already said a little bit about my parcours in the last years. And it is true that I did start in Switzerland, and I was mainly interested at that time in ancient languages, Latin, Greek. And then I moved a little bit more in the East with Sanskrit in India. And this is at that time that I got interested in Iranian languages, like Old Persian or Avestan. And it was mainly linguistics at that point, and being able to do parallels between languages and how it works. For me, it's always amazing to see that it always comes back to something equivalent and how it evolves over time. And this is why I did concentrate mainly on what we call these Indo-European languages. So they all come from the same branch, and Iranian is one of these branch. And this interest led me to Paris in 2005 because I wanted to work in Avestan studies. And at that point, it was not available in Switzerland to go really far further. And this is why I went there to study with Jean Kellens, who was at that time professor at the Collège de France. And slowly, I discovered that it was more than just an interest in language. And I think that the interest in religion and rituality came afterwards. Because at the beginning, people just explained to me the text like it means this, because it's like this with the root and the etymology. Okay, good. But yeah, how do you use that and when? And to be honest, when I read the text the first time, I was slightly confused because I didn't really understand it. Yeah, I did understand it on a grammatical aspect, but I was not able to see how it was in real time.
But I think that's something that all of us, when we first started reading these materials in their original feel, it's a really, really difficult thing to get a clear sort of glimpse of what you're looking at. And I think that's what makes so many of us continue and search, because we're in a sense trying to able to understand what it is that is happening in these really interesting, fascinating texts that are quite often rather opaque. So can you tell us a little bit about what it was like studying in France and working with Kellens and such? Because I think our student experiences really often are quite formative for how we look at what we do as the years go on.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think I met people at that time that definitely gave me the path for the future. And I could have done something else if I met someone else at that point. But I think that Jean Kellens was really nice with me, and he always was kind and always told me, yes, we can go a little bit more far away, but never discouraged me of doing this. So I think it was the first point. And it was also a great time in Paris at that moment, because I had Jean Kellens, obviously, but not only. Pierre Lecoq, another Iranist, was there. And so I have been able to follow his courses. And we had also Pierre Briand working more on the Achaemenid period, and Philippe Heuser more in the Middle Iranian languages, or even someone like Rika Gislen working more on the numismatics. And so for me, it has been really nice to be able to discover all this and be able to know what I want to do. Because at the beginning, it's difficult to know exactly what you want to do. And it's important to go in many directions to see what is your thing and what you will become.
Yeah, and I think in a way you were very privileged, because most of us, when we started working on this material, most of us were in cities where you had one professor who worked on Iranian studies. So you got a lot of what, you got what they were offering. But in a sense, you were able to see, had different personalities, different experiences, they're in different institutional contexts. And also they all have different disciplinary focus. So you're able to get a little bit with material culture, you're able to get some with language, some with linguistics, philology, as you said, numismatics. So you get the coin side, and then of course Rika also has worked so much on the seals, and so you get a much more well-rounded kind of understanding of the material. And I have to say, when I first got interested in the field, coming from a Parsi background, I was really thinking about it as Zoroastrianism. But in many ways, once you start to explore the world of ancient Iran, you realize that we're dealing with so many different things. There's culture, there's language, there's religion, there's politics. And then within that, we have so many other sub-disciplines that feed those things. So when you were working with these people, did you always, was it relatively quick that you decided that Avestan would be the thing that you would focus on, or was that something that happened sort of along the way?
I think it has been pretty quick. So first, because I moved from Switzerland to Paris to do Avestan, so I think it was already a strong choice at that point. And it's also because at that moment, I thought there is so many things to be done in Avestan studies. And this was something that really interested me, because I have done 5 years of Sanskrit and I really liked this. But I had the impression that they had already everything: edition, a translation, a dictionary, many things. However, in the Avestan studies, I was always like, we still need a dictionary, we still need an edition, we still need some historical backgrounds. We need many things.
Basic tools, in a sense.
Yes, and I wanted to be part of this and discover or try to understand a little bit more. And I think this is why gets me really into Avestan studies and not something else.
And when you were working on Avestan, the way that different places, different institutions teach it in a different way. So I'd be very curious, like, how was it taught there? Did you start with young Avestan? Did you start with old Avestan? Was there a grammar? Did you start reading texts? Was it comparative linguistics? What was the pedagogical approach there?
So I started with Old Avestan in Switzerland, where I did just 1 semester of Old Avestan. And obviously it was very difficult because we are not very sure. But still I thought, okay, this is what I want to do. But as you said, I think there is a big issue with the grammar and how we can learn Avestan. And when I arrived in Paris, it was not properly speaking Avestan courses. It was the old way. You go to a course and someone reads a text and explain you how it works. Right. But you don't really build it like this is the first person singular or whatever. So to be honest, I started learning it by myself with the manual of Cherveux, which was available online. And I followed the lesson one after the other. And I did learn like this. Obviously, I had some knowledge of other ancient languages, so it does help because it was not starting from scratch either.
Okay, so actually, in that sense, it's very similar to mine, because obviously, yes, being a student of Cherveux, I use that grammar, and I still teach with that grammar when I do teach Avestan. Did you find it, like so many of us do, frustrating when you suddenly realize that the forms are all over the place and they're so fragmentary and there's so much things that are missing? And
of course, and at the beginning you just think, I'm stupid, I cannot understand it, and then you realize it's not you, it's just Avestan language is a difficult one, and each time you have a rule, you have an exception. And even when you teach it, you say something to your student, and like 2 minutes afterwards, you say, "Oh, but it does not work all the time." And so they just smile, saying, "But how can I know?" "Oh, you will know one day. You just practice."
Okay. So in that sense, our education was identical because I had the exact same experience. And I still feel like that happens all the time. You say, well, there are no rules. There are tendencies, most of which will get broken in exactly as you said, 2 minutes or less, you know? And let's transition a little bit. Tell me, what are you working on currently?
Now it's a big step because I really started with Avestan, with this old tradition, and now I am working on something more contemporary. And my interest at the moment is to try to understand the rituals in India from the 16th up to the 19th century commune era, so in the last few centuries. And in order to do so, I have been working in the last year with Kerman Daruvala, who lives in Mumbai, and who trained me at the beginning in Gujarati, because in order to do so, you need to have some Gujarati knowledge, which I didn't do. And I still do not speak Gujarati, but I am able to understand what I need for my research. Speaking and reading are two different things.
Very much so.
And it's always funny because for the daughter of Kerman, I am the one working on Gujarati. So she always sends me WhatsApp audio in Gujarati, like if I can understand and answer. But this is two different words, Gujarati in manuscript or Gujarati in the everyday life. And so what I do is that I read Gujarati in manuscripts in order to understand what the priest should do while reciting the Avestan text, and what are the differences in the manuscripts, and how we can explain that, if we can, because it's not always easy to understand.
And when you're looking at these sort of ritual instructions, how much do you try to contextualize them vis-a-vis what we know of the ritual instructions on the Iranian side, and how much can we actually understand about any, let's say, regional variation that may be taking place within the Indian context, or different parts of Gujarat, or different panthaks, or something like that?
So I started really with one specific ceremony, because you have many rituals, but one has to choose at the beginning. And I started with the long one, which is the Yasna ceremony called Yishni in India, which is performed by two priests and which has been recorded by the MuYa project to which I was attached. And so this was already a first good part for me, that I have been able to see the ceremony within the film and see what I should read in the ritual directions. So it's already very interesting to compare what is done nowadays to what we find in the manuscript. And with this, I used what I have been done by Alberto Cantera in Berlin, who has been working quite a lot on the Iranian ritual directions. And the aim is to do the bridge between all this and go from Iran to India till nowadays. And I am trying to see that. But I think it's very difficult now to really say if it's different in one person in Gujarat or another one, because we don't have so many manuscripts and they are quite close to each of them. But still, it's in progress.
So you mentioned the MuYa project, and maybe for many people might know about it, but I'm sure there are plenty who don't. So perhaps you could say a little bit about the project, and about and also tell us a little bit about sort of your involvement with the project and working with Almut and such.
So it has been a project running for 6 years, from 2016 to 2022. And I have been involved into it for the 5 years of the project. So it's quite a long time. And the aim of the project was to work on this ceremony, this Yasna ceremony, from two perspectives. The manuscript perspective, what we have in the manuscripts themselves, how the Avestan text is written, and what does it mean, and do a critical edition, really saying, this is like this in this manuscript, but this is like that in the other manuscript, and what we can understand. And the other part of the project was to do this ceremony film of the Yasna ceremony, which has been recorded in India in 2017 in Mumbai, and to do an interactive film with subtitles. So the film has been subtitled, and we can have the Avestan text, and the English translation is coming very soon. And then we have a few indications on the ritual directions. And so this has been part of the project. And then to do this bridge between manuscript and tradition, something which has not been done so far, I would say.
And also another really interesting component that could never have been done before is the multimedia side, right? With actual technology and with sort of 3D, with 3D cameras and sort of, and the filming aspect. And I think this is something that is worth sort of mentioning, is that in many ways, the study of Avestan has really taken on a sort of new dimensions in the last, let's say, I don't know, maybe say 10 years or last decade loosely, with a lot of new approaches to trying to examine these old problems that have been with us since the editions were produced in the late 19th and very early 20th century.
Yeah, I think technology is amazing what we can do nowadays, and also put everything available online. I mean, before, when you did a film or a movie, it was somewhere at some one place, and you had to go there to the library if you want to see it. While now you can put everything online. So it's also full open access to everyone, and not just to a few very important people that can access it. So I think this is the other important point within the project.
I think, one of the things that may be less appreciated or less known by Zoroastrians in North America, or also India and Iran, is that so many of these really important multi-year projects, like the one that you were associated with, have been funded by European by European research councils. Whereas the European Research Council or Alberto's project in Berlin is largely funded by the German government. So the funding that has gone into these very long-term projects that hire multiple people, not only have they allowed these fields to advance, but they've also allowed the professors, whether it's Alberto in Berlin or Almut in SOAS, to hire research fellows, PhD students. And I think this is something that this particular model doesn't really exist in the North American context. And it really is one of the reasons why I wanted to also do these interviews, because I wanted to sort of show the community that there's a lot of things that are happening that may not be very obvious from the North American side. So from your perspective, what was it like working on a project like this? Like, what's it like working with different people? Like, I've always worked very kind of in a very solo way, just, myself and my computer, after, obviously working with Chervo originally, but you had the opportunity and sort of to work in a sort of a team-like context. So how did that work, and how did the relationship sort of, how did you land up deciding to do this work with Kerman? How did that kind of, like, what was the mechanics of it if he's based in Mumbai?
Yeah, so first, I think my motto in the last year has been together we are stronger. And I think this kind of projects show how many people can work together and produce something that would be impossible for only one person. Also because you use the skills of everyone and you put all this together, because you have one who is maybe more trained in IT, which is something very important, and someone in Gujarati and someone in Avestan. And you put all this together. We were quite a big team. All together, we were between 10 and 15 people. So maybe it is not seen like this online, but it's IT people who develop the software, more the scholars, more the PhD students who also did a huge work into all this. And then it's because of this teamwork that it has been possible for me to start Gujarati. I always wanted to do Gujarati, but it was impossible because no course were taught. And, you can try alone, but it's quite difficult. And so Kerman spent a few months in London, and one day he said, "Oh, we should read together with a ritual direction from the book of Anklesarya." Anklesarya was a priest in the 19th century in Mumbai, and he did a kind of edition of these ritual directions. And this is a book which is still used nowadays in the training school in Mumbai. So it became one of the most important editions of ritual directions in Gujarati. It is not the only one, but I don't know why it became so important. And so we started reading this like a reading group every week. And then I started and I said, I want to read everything and I want to pursue. And so we started doing it together. And I say, I think we should write an article. And he said, oh, it would be amazing. And then I said, I think we should write a book because it's too big for an article. And I think in a year time, we did that. So it has been very spontaneous and we did work well together. It's not easy to work with other people. I mean, it's amazing to work with other people, but being able to have the same speed, to understand each other, and also say, I do not agree with you, and exchange, and then say, okay, I changed my mind. I agree with you now, or I still have not changed my mind, but he changed his mind. So it's a process to work together. And we need to have comprehension for each other. But it has been an amazing moment to work together.
I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. I myself, as you know, I'm working on a co-authored project with R.S. Zaini, who's here, who's in the audience. And so it's a remarkable thing when you work with someone else, because you really are twice as good as if you do it just by yourself, because there's someone challenging you, there's someone asking the questions that you don't necessarily think to ask. In a sense, it's also sometimes quite reassuring when two people are looking at the material the same way. You feel like you're not a crazy person, So it's one of these things that I think is something that more of us should try and do, and it makes for a much richer field, and especially in the context of how the way that the two of you have worked, where you have one person who's from the community and one person who's from outside the community. In a sense, you see things from different positionality, not in addition to the kind of the intellectual work. So, speaking of books, this is a question that I always like asking people. So do you have a favorite book in the field, the one that sort of you really you enjoyed going back to, or was very sort of evocative when you were first a student?
Obviously, choosing one is very difficult because we have so many possibilities. I would say I would go for an old one because it might be the one I have opened the most in the last 20 years. And this is this Avestan German dictionary, which has been written by Bartholomé in 1904, so already more than 100 years ago. And I think it also goes well with my own story, because when I chose Avestan, as I told you, like already 20 years ago, unless Avestan chose me, I don't really know well. I had at that time some kind of naive thought that one day I will do the new Bartholomé. And it was one of the aspects. So I think it would be maybe my favorite book, just because you need it, whatever you do in Avestan, you start with Bartholomé and then you expand. And I think that the new dictionary will come in the next years. But as we have seen, it's something that needs to be a team project. I don't think we are in the 19th century anymore, where one person can do a huge work by himself. Now we are really in this team building work. And I think it's also something that has to be changed in the field. And it goes with what you have said. Until now, people maybe do not know, but it's not well seen to write a book with someone else. It's like if, you are not the only author.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, but we still have written the book together, and maybe it's bigger than if I had written it only myself. And it's not because you have written it with someone else that it is bad. And I think that some things need to be changed in the future to see a co-author book like something which is strong and not something which is weak. And I think that's the opposite, in fact, to be able to work with someone who has another knowledge than you have, to expand your own knowledge, and also say, I am not the only one who can do it. We should do it together.
Well, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think there's always been this sort of historical aspect that we have this sort of cult of genius that, the individual mind sort of has to produce something with the idea, in the notion that if two people are doing it, it somehow gets watered down. And I completely agree with you. That's not the right way to think about it at all, because different perspectives make for a richer sort of scholarly experience. But it's interesting in your career. In fact, you have worked together, and you have co-authored 3 times. And in fact, I must confess, I forgot to mention one of your publications, your introduction to Avestan with Alberto Cantera. So this one, for example, is such a useful research tool, because in a way it allows us to study Avestan with a different kind of pedagogical approach than, for example, the way that Chervos was done, which he produced, originally in the mid-90s. So I hear a rumor that there's some talk that this French book might come out in English at some point. Is this true?
It is completely true. To be honest, I have been proofreading all the week, the English version. So I proofread a few months ago the English translation, which has been made by a student of Alberto Cantera in Berlin. And obviously we had to correct a few things. And now I am proofreading the proof. So it's more what should be in italics and is not in italics and other things. So it is a forthcoming book in the coming months. I don't know, maybe January 2024. It will be published at Arasovist in Germany. And it is already available online. So we can already see the cover. So it's more than a rumor, it's a truth.
Okay, that's wonderful.
Because we did it in French. So the full story is that, as we said before, it's difficult to learn Avestan, and we don't really have a lot of material. So we had this manual by Cherveux, and so Alberto made another manual in Spanish when he was teaching in Spain. And when I started teaching in Paris in 2008, I thought, what should I do with my students? I need to have something in French, because you cannot expect them to read something in English to learn the Avestan and translate. And so I decided to start translating the Spanish version into the French one. And more I did it, then I added new lessons, and then we decided to publish this with Alberto, expand it. So it's a 10 years story to get to the French translation, to the French version. However, French is not read by everyone. And so this is why now we have been working on the English translation for a wider audience. And the aim is really to have this manual aspect. So you have one lesson, you see something, you have vocabulary, and then you have exercise, which go with the exercise, with the vocabulary and the grammar. And so you have a kind of autonomy, lesson after lesson, when you grow on your knowledge to go one step further.
No, and it's so important to say that without these kinds of works, which took a decade to produce, it is very difficult to get new students into the field, to stay in the field, and to themselves grow into being able to teach this material themselves. So, our term starts on Monday, and right now I'm preparing a small little sort of correction and revision of a document that Cherveux made years ago on teaching the Middle Persian script.
Yeah.
It's taken me hours because the fonts don't work correctly, and everything has come out funny, and everything is in the wrong place. And it sounds so silly, but I think a lot of times people in the community don't appreciate that the work that we do is not just extremely technically difficult, but it's also often very tedious. And so, I think those of us who've done it, we can all appreciate just how incredibly valuable it is to have you work through this thing and produce this for us. So let me ask you a different question. So, do you have a sort of a central research question or a set of questions that motivates you? Like, is there something that you keep returning to as being the kind of the core question that you would like to answer?
I think that the main one, the general one, is try to understand how a religion can last over centuries, even millennia in the case of Zoroastrianism. When you think about that, it's just amazing. When you say to people it started 1 millennium or even before that, before the Commune Era, and it's still alive nowadays. Sometimes they don't believe you because they always speak about Christianism, other religion, but clearly it is a longer one on many aspects. And I think it's quite interesting to see how you can manage to still be alive nowadays and be able to evolve with the time, with the history, and with everything that has happened. It has not been easy for Zoroastrians over years and over centuries. It has not been an easy story all the time. And I think it goes with what I do with trying to understand also this history of the ritual traditions through the Gujarati sources, which has been less studied over the last century, also because the ritual has been put aside in the Avestan studies. It was quite there at the end of the 19th century, and you can see that when you read the translation of Darmesteter in French, because it did incorporate ritual directions from the Gujarati and the Middle Persian tradition. But then all of a sudden, all this disappeared, and we were only focused on the meaning of this word in this specific context, and if it's a sh or a sh or whatever it is. And I think we did forget a little bit the big picture, also because we said it's just a fragment of something that we have lost. And then now that we do see that it's a long tradition and it's not a fragment, we go back to the ritual. And I think that the ritual is also the way of going through ages until nowadays. So my bigger picture would be try to understand all this and the religion on a wider perspective. Yeah.
So one of the things that is often asked to me from members of the community is they say, why are you philologists so obsessed with rituals? And I always say, our obsessions are essentially generated by what the texts were written, were composed, transmitted, and then written, and what we have in the manuscripts. So what we can only work on what we have.
And we have a ritual corpus. So
exactly.
We are focused on the ritual because we don't have history in the Avesta. I mean, I don't have a king who has done this and who did that. And so I need to focus on what I have in the text themselves.
Yeah, and I think this is something that is often not well understood by people who haven't read the material in the original, that the Avestan corpus is a ritual corpus. That is the Avesta that has survived to us today in the manuscripts through the centuries was the Avesta as it was recited in the frame of rituals. It's not like Avestan in that sense must have been much broader and expansive in the deep, remote antique past. But it's not like reading Greek or Sanskrit where you can read philosophical literature, or you can read a novel, or you could read, let's say, poetry or economics. So we don't have that. That's not, the Avestan corpus is really a ritual corpus. And I think, to me, one of the things that is, I think, sometimes a bit unfortunate about the way that we contemporary people are today is that the ritual was sort of the binding factor that passed century by century through time, and of course it changed and adapted to the various Iranian eras, and then of course into the Indian context, and then there's sort of interplay between the two communities. But today, for most of us who are not very necessary, many of us are not particularly ritually focused. We're not going to a fire temple every day or performing a ritual beyond a personal ritual of, let's say, a sadhana kasti or something like that. The idea of what the ritual means has become a little bit different, or it's a little bit more opaque. So my question to you is that, in many ways, we study the past. We study the Zoroastrian past because that's the textual record that we have. But what, in your opinion, is the future of Zoroastrian philology and the textual study of this Zoroastrian past? What would you like to see the study of Avestan, early Zoroastrian studies, ritual and such evolve into?
What is the future of all this?
Yeah.
I think what is important for me is to say that we have on one side the academic people, and on the other side the community. And I think that we could learn from each other on many levels. And I would say that one point for me is not to put aside something because it's more contemporary or because it's too ancient, but try to bring all this together to have a full history, and also not say that something is wrong or good. It's just something which is done at a certain moment in time, and that a religion has to adapt to the reality of things. And so I am not trying to say what is the oldest version or the purest version of a ritual, but more what it is at a certain point in time. And it is the same, in fact, with the textual studies. What does it mean? For example, the Pahlavi translation. So Avestan texts have been translated in Pahlavi. It doesn't mean that it is a correct translation, but it's very interesting to see what they did understand at a certain moment in time. And it would be the same with modern translation. It's very interesting to see what it means nowadays for someone. And we go with the practice, as a practice is something very personal. And there is not one good or one bad practice. There is just a practice that suits you and that you do at different moments in your life and at different places. And I think it's maybe to have some understanding of each other, including in the field itself, and not necessarily thinking that something is better than something else. There is many ways of doing what we do.
Yeah, and I think it's worth saying that if an Avestan speaker could take a time machine and see what the Pahlavi interpreters had done with a text that he or she would know, they would be quite shocked. And equivalently, if the Pahlavi speaker could then jump forward and see what the classical Persian era had done with it, or what the medieval Gujarati period does with it, and that's not to mention, obviously, that, ancient Zoroastrianism starts in Central Asia, but then largely becomes a very, very dominated in the kind of the what is today the modern nation state of Iran. So we got all these regional variations, which of course we see talked about by communities, who are watching the Zoroastrians and interacting with them, whether it's Christians or Buddhists or Jews or Muslims, Manichaeans, Mazdakites, all these various other groups. And I think that's something that I think is so interesting about the way that you work, and the way that, in a sense, that many of us now of our generation have come to, is we're no longer sort of analyzing texts or rituals as sort of some platonic ideal of some perfect form, and that what we have is just some debased, broken down version of it. We're seeing these things as snapshots of what individual communities did at a particular moment. And of course, sometimes they're fragmentary, so we can't reconstruct them perfectly. But I think this is a major shift in the study of Zoroastrianism. And I think this is something that it would be quite useful for the community to also recognize, that not, just because something looks different from one period to another period, or one geography to another geography, doesn't make one right and one wrong. It just means that human cultural variation is quite diverse. So let me, in the kind of the mode of this sort of future mode, if I can ask another question. what's a project that you would really like to work on in the future? So now now you're at Strasbourg, so you have a permanent job. It'll take you a few years to kind of get, to wrap your mind around all the difficulties and challenges that come with all the administrative and teaching responsibilities you have. But at some point, once you're sort of up and running, and what's something that you would really like to do?
It goes with the book we mentioned before. So I would be very happy to be part of a project whose aim is to provide this Avestan English dictionary. I don't think that nowadays we will do an Avestan German dictionary anymore. And it's clearly going to English to a wider diffusion. So I think I would be happy to be part of such a project. It's difficult in a few years to know what would be my project because so many things are going on and future projects depend on what is going on at the moment. So obviously now my contribution is more on this Indian tradition in the last centuries that will be put with what has been done already by Almut Hintze in London and that she will pursue, and with Alberto Contera more on the Iranian tradition. And I think that the next step will be the dictionary that we all want to have one day. And that will also help the student or the people who are interested. Because now when you say you have only one dictionary, it's in German, it's 100 years before. And so you never know if what you read is correct or not, but you need to learn. I mean, it's very an obstacle that you have to pass and go through. So I would be happy to be part of such a project.
And not only a German dictionary, but with Bavarian German, so you have a whole level as well, I think I also want to add something that I think neither of us has quite said, but I think is an important part about contextualizing the really fundamentally important aspect of what you have done, studying these Gujarati ritual instructions with Kerman, which is that the ritual instructions, as you said, had been studied by Darmstädter a little bit in the 19th century. I mean, he was a genius. So, he really understood how important this was. But one of the very unfortunate aspects of the way that our discipline is constructed is that the study of Zoroastrianism has to start from the beginning and come all the way to the present, because as you pointed out earlier, it's such a long, rich tradition. But inevitably, what that has meant is that most of us who work on the early textual side, and by early, I mean who work with Avestan and Pahlavi. So we're talking from, let's say, 1500 BC, whatever you think, all the way into, 1000, 1200 AD. That period of time is where the fundamental material has been produced, right? So the original Avestan material that we have, and then all the Pahlavi commentaries and explanations that kind of allow you to see its trends, its movement through time. But there was obviously important work done by, for classical Persian, and obviously done by so many important Parsi priests. But Western scholarship had largely ignored Gujarati altogether, where one could easily say that the Gujarati corpus is one of the richest, biggest corpora that we have in, let's say, Zoroastrian literature. And so I think this work that you do, while on one surface may look sort of very technical and connected with little ritual instructions, is actually, I hope, the beginning of something that will really expand out our understanding and
I think
interest.
it is just opening a door to something which is huge. But we need to go into it with something small,
of course,
in order to make it available. And now more I work on this, more I see what else can be done. And I know also that Almut Hintze in London will work on more ritual Gujarati material in the coming years. And so it's only the first step of something that is going on. And I am still working with Kerman. So now we are really working on transcribing from 5 or 6 manuscripts the Gujarati ritual directions, and in order to make them available in transcription and translation and with commentaries. And so that's a work in progress. And then it's just the first step. And I am sure that many things have been done in India, but just ignored because it has been done in Gujarati, and it will open up new doors. And it's just a matter of language that is less accessible. And hopefully it will not be the case in the coming years anymore. And I think it's important to show this also to the academic field, that there is something interesting. And it goes also with this wider perspective that what is modern or contemporary is not wrong, is not bad, but is really worth of interest. And we need to go also in this historical critical approach and how it is at a certain moment in time in this context with what is around, and if we can explain this in a way or in another. And it's also something that goes with what I do in Strasbourg, because I am attached to a department of history of religions. And so I need to put this in a wider perspective for students. And it's very important to show how it evolves and why, and all the history behind.
No, and that was exactly my in a sense, it's very similar to my career trajectory. When I was at Harvard, I did a lot of philological work. I taught contemporary Zoroastrianism, was one of the first people to teach that in North America. And then when I went to Stanford, I was in a religion department. So again, I had to make things much more accessible. And so that sort of brings me to perhaps the last question, and then we can open it up to the Q&A. So how, in your opinion, how can we grow this field and make it more accessible to Zoroastrians themselves?
Yes, I think there is two parts. And I think to grow the field, I would say that first is what we do, is the fact to make Zoroastrianism more known to a general audience. Because also if we want position, if we want project, we need to show that Zoroastrianism has something to give and is not something old that should be put aside. And in my life, I have always been surprised, in fact, by the number of people who was not aware of this religion, even with such a long history. And that they don't know that ritual ceremonies, priests are still something that is current nowadays. And so this is why also in the last year, I have been able to speak myself about this or invite colleagues to speak about Zoroastrianism here in Strasbourg in seminars attended by undergraduate students. And it's also the first step is to teach the young generation that will maybe do something else, but at least they will know it exists. And maybe it will be something more interdisciplinary. And they will also spread the news that, yes, Zoroastrianism is alive. So I would like maybe also to do an exhibition maybe here in Strasbourg also to spread a little bit more knowledge on this. And with the second part of your question, I think that what we do now go well to this direction is to do this bridge between the academic world and the community itself, and show that we can learn from each other and we can go on the same path, and we don't have to fight or to say that we do not understand each other. And the technology obviously is a very important point into all this. And I think today is a good example. We are all over the world, and we are all together speaking about something similar. And so I think it would be certainly also the next step. But it takes time. It's not something that can be changed all of a sudden. But I think that we have seen in the last year so many positions. We have Miguel Angel in Toronto, we have Charity in Irvine, myself in Strasbourg, Mariano Enriquello now at SOAS. So the position already existed, but still it does exist because sometimes someone just go pensioned and then everything disappeared. So it does show that there is something going on, at least in Europe and US, and it should just be the start of something new. And we should work together to pursue this. And I hope I will be able to do that on my level.
Yeah. Well, I'm very glad that you mentioned Mariano, because he is also here. So Mariano Enriquello is now the new lecturer for contemporary Zoroastrianism at SOAS, and he will be our next speaker. So, you've given me the wonderful segue to the next one. So I think now would be a good time to take some questions. I think Arzan will sort of curate them for us or moderate, and then I can kind of I mean, Arzan, do you want to jump in or?
Sure. So let's go. We've got quite a few questions. The first one is from Bami and Linda in Albuquerque. The question is, how different are Pahlavi, Pazand, Old Persian, Middle Persian, and New Persian from each other? Could a linguist knowledgeable in one understand the others?
So this is a good question, and I think it's one big difficulty in Zoroastrian studies, is that we have to deal with so many languages in order to understand what is going on. And so some languages are quite close to each other. So Pahlavi and Middle Persian are, I mean, I would say the same. Some people do a difference, but it's the same. And Pazand is Pahlavi written in Avestan script, just because it's easier to read the Avestan script than the Pahlavi one. It's certainly one reason why I do Avestan, because I can read it very easily. While when I did this Middle Persian, when I was a student, I was like, how can I know how to read the word? Unless you know the word, you cannot read it. So I would say that these three languages are very close. And I think it's pretty obvious that someone knowing Middle Persian will have less difficulties in New Persian and vice versa, because you have a lot of similarities. It's the same branch. But it's not because you know one that you can understand the other one. And this is the difficult part.
Yeah. So I'll jump in here as well a little bit. So
yeah, because you are the specialist of this, not me.
What? But so Old Persian is written in the cuneiform script.
Yeah.
So it is, and we're looking at sort of the 6th century BC.
Yeah.
Middle Persian is really a stage. So Middle Persian is really a stage of the language that we would loosely say is sort of Sasanian and early Islamic. So let's say 2nd, 3rd century AD from the Sasanian, 3rd century AD for the Sasanians, and into the 7th century AD, mid 7th century. But in Middle Persian, we have many types of Middle Persian. Yeah. So Manichaean Middle Persian has a different script. The Christian Psalter has a slightly different script. The Pahlavi, which is literary or Zoroastrian Middle Persian, is a different script. The inscriptions, coins, and seals are in a different script. So while it's in many ways somewhat the same language, there are different stages, and the scripts are different. So it's quite a nuisance to learn all these things. It takes time, as you said. And then
it takes time, and Iranian is really known to have a script for each language. So each time you want to learn a new language, which is Iranian, you have to learn a new script.
The script, exactly. and Pazand, as Céline completely, correctly pointed out, is that it's really Pahlavi. Perhaps we could even say maybe slightly later Pahlavi written in Avestan. So if you see Pazand and you didn't know what you were looking at, you would just think it's Avestan, at first glance. And then, of course, with Persian, when we say New Persian, we have both classical Persian and, let's say, modern or contemporary Persian, not to mention, of course, dialects and such that also exist. And so, in a way, a Persian speaker will understand and be able to read quite a decent amount of Pahlavi. Let's say the about a third of the easy, let's say if Pahlavi can be divided 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 is sort of easy, mid, intermediate, and very difficult. I would say that a Persian speaker will probably get the first half pretty much for free, but only if they can read the script.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So the main issue is the script, because this is the same for me. If I see some New Persian in transcription, I will be able to understand a little bit. If I see it in Persian script, I am completely lost. I did try Persian many times, and each time I was just, oh my God, the script, it's so difficult. So there is also the issue of the script. And Middle Persian, if I see it in a transcription, I will say, oh yes, of course, I will recognize many things. But if I see the original script, it takes me a little bit more time. Also because we have the same issue in Middle Persian. There is no real dictionary for Middle Persian. And so it's not like if you can look in the dictionary and find your answer. You will look in a concise dictionary, you will maybe not find it. And then what you can do? try to help someone who knows this word in another language and say, oh, this must be that. So,
yeah, Middle Persian is one of the very rare languages where an expert can write to another expert and say, do you know what this word is?
exactly. Exactly.
So yeah, and I think this is something that these philological difficulties are the inheritances of this very long tradition that has evolved over centuries. And so it often means that for almost all of us, we come from different perspectives. So, if you come from the Sanskrit side, Avestan is much easier to understand. If you come from the Persian side, Pahlavi is much easier to understand. If you come from Greek, the old Persian side is easier to understand. So, it really depends on where you come into the material from. So, okay, let's see.
So the next one is from Maruk Motafram, where she says that in North America, we Parsis and Iranian Zartustis come together after generations. How does knowing and understanding the Yasna ceremony help the North American community unite as one Zartusti community?
Oh,
so this is a difficult question for I if I can jump in here for Céline and for myself. This is a difficult question for us as philologists, because our job is to take the textual record of the past and show you what Zoroastrians have done in whichever textual record we are working in at that moment. So, the question of what ritual can be as a binding social phenomenon for a community, that's a question that the community has to answer. But the value a community would get from a particular ritual is only as meaningful as our ability to make the ritual explicable and meaningful and accessible to you. So in a very real sense, we are not in the position of telling you what it should mean to you. We are potentially in the position of being sort of intermediaries between the past and the present. We serve as bridges in that way. So it's a hard question, because I get asked this question very often. So all this old stuff is nice, so what should I do with it? Well, I always say, you have to figure out what to do with it. My job is to make it available to you. And
it can be different for everyone. Not everyone is looking for the same thing. I think everyone has to choose.
Very Zoroastrian in logic. Everyone has to choose. And it's true. And I have to say, it's worth saying that different communities in the contemporary space have different relationships with ritual. So Iranian Zoroastrians have a historically different understanding and relationship with rituals than their predecessors. Let's say the way you understand ritual today in the early 21st century is very different than the early 20th century, than the early 19th century, just to keep it early for each of the periods. And the same would apply for India. Rituals would have looked very different in Gujarat when I was a boy than they would today. I'm not that old, but I'm not that young either. So, things are in flux in that sense. So,
I would also say that Yasna ceremony is only one ceremony among many others. And it's just something that we have studied quite a lot because it's of easier access. But I also did some research on shorter liturgies. And I think there is still a lot to be done on shorter liturgies, which is maybe more with the people outside and not necessarily within a fire temple, because the Yasna ceremony, it's a full process with 2 priests within a fire temple. It lasts at least 2 hours and a half, but you have many, many other rituals. I think Zoroastrianism is very, very wide in this perspective. And there is still a lot to be done to show that Yasna is only one among many others. And I would say it's also this which is important for the community, not focusing only on the Yasna, but Yasna is just the door for us to open wider perspective on other rituals.
Yeah.
So sorry.
And Arza, just one sec. If I can add something, it's worth saying that in the that last spring when Alberto Cantera came to Oxford and gave his Ratan by Kathrak lectures, the first of 3, and now he'll do 3 more in October and November. He also makes the point that there's so many rituals that are mentioned in the manuscripts that are no longer performed, or if they are performed, don't look like the way the manuscripts describe them. And I think, Céline, that in a sense is exactly your point that you're making, is that there's a great amount of variability here that is often now largely not understood, or poorly understood, or not as appreciated. I think, Arzan, so the
next question actually from Nauzar Hormazdi is very relevant. And Nauzar asks, so what are some of the major differences in Zoroastrian rituals, that the ones you're researching or studying, as it evolved in India over ancient Iran? And additionally, have you been able to detect the impact of local Gujarati culture on Zoroastrian rituals as it evolved in Gujarat? If so, can you give a few examples?
So this is a very interesting question. Obviously, we are still working on all this, so I don't have final answers. And we need also to say that there are different branches even in Gujarat. So we are also trying to study the edition of the Kadmi tradition. So the Kadmi tradition is slightly different than the other one in India, and sometimes it is closer to the Iranian one. Major differences, it's difficult because we are really going on some minor things. So now we are going step by step within the Yasna, and we are recently chapter 22 on the 72 chapters. And we have found a few differences, but they are not so huge. And I think it's also what we do see by working on this. It's tiny things happening here and there, but it's not a complete different ritual, not at all. And we may think that there is some influence from Gujarat, but it's very difficult because for this, we also have to read a little bit more what has been done in this period in Gujarat and how it can have influence the ritual itself. And we need to be aware that in the manuscript, it's only a few amount of commentaries. So they are not very long. They are very short. One striking example I have seen is just that in some places, the priest has to stand up and to do a few steps to go up to the fire. And this is not done in the Indian tradition anymore, in Yasna 64, while it is done in the Iranian tradition. And it's always interesting to see also how the performance is linked with the Avestan text itself. Because when the priest has to do these steps, he's reciting the term steps in Avestan itself. So he said steps, and he does steps at the same time. And it's not done in India anymore, but it is still appearing in the manuscript in the 16th century. So we can see when it starts disappearing, why we may not know it, but then it is not written anymore. But as you can see, it's really something tiny. We are not speaking about huge things. So I think it's just step by step, things evolving, and some adding maybe. And it's also difficult sometimes to know if there is a real adding or if it was already like this in the Iranian tradition, but we do not have a trace of this in the Iranian tradition. When you look at the Gujarati ritual directions, there is this aim of providing full information on what the priest should do. While in the Iranian, it goes straight to the fact, what is really important. But they don't put a lot of information. They will, for example, in the Iranians, they will say they have to drink the auma 3 times. While in the Indians, they will have to drink it 3 times, and they will have to wash the hand, wash the mouth, and wash the table. It doesn't mean it was not done in the Iranian, but maybe it was obvious for the Iranian people, so they didn't write this in the manuscript, but it was not so obvious for the Indian. So they decided to provide many information. So it's also difficult to really know sometimes if it's an evolution or if it's just something that was not written in the Iranian tradition because it was a known fact. And if you know it, you don't write it.
Yeah, and this is a very, very important point, which is that so much of what makes the study of Zoroastrianism historically difficult for us is that Zoroastrian knowledge producers, priests, scholars, and others in the past, they were in a private conversation with each other. They all knew what they're talking about. So there was all this implicit knowledge. And because of all this implicit knowledge that is not actually laid out, it makes it very difficult for us to work out and try to figure out what it means in its particular context in a particular period. And in that sense, the study of these ritual instructions just gives us a little bit of a toehold into some of the implicit knowledge. And every now and again, we will be able to correlate some things or ask a different question because we see something that looks a little different than somewhere else or looks the same. And this is the artfulness of what Céline works on, is the ability to take small pieces of information and have it sort of aggregate over time to give us a sort of a more granular picture of things that now we don't know so well. So I think this is the great value of like real fundamental step-by-step philology. Philology is not an easy thing precisely because there's no macro solution to things. It has to be built from the kind of ground up.
Yeah, it doesn't. It takes time to reach conclusion. So hopefully we will have a book in a 2 years' time with something more general about what we can say. But what I would also maybe add is that it's amazing how the Avestan text does not really change. So we do see that Avestan is really sacred. It's what means that the ritual works. And what you do at the time might change, but the text itself is still the same. So I would say that everything goes well because the Avestan text is still there, but you don't have many differences. Yeah, phonetic or orthographical differences, but the text is still there. And it is mainly the same between the Indian and the Iranian tradition. So we do see that the differences are more in the ritual than in the original text, because I think they don't want to change this.
Yeah, because it's sacred. I mean,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
and I think it's one of the religion where you have such a text over centuries which has not been translated and which is still recited in Avestan. Because for many other people, it's just so normal to have a translation of the sacred texts. But it's not the case in Zoroastrianism. You only have Avestan.
I mean, that's exactly it. I mean, if you think about it, every Zoroastrian in this Zoom meeting, if he or she were to perform their prayers, they're doing their prayers in Avestan. They're not doing their prayers in English or Persian or Gujarati. There are parts that have those things added in, but primarily the actual prayers remain in Avestan, in a language that was likely a largely dead language even by the time the Sasanians came into the picture. So we're talking, we're looking at such an enormous time frame of the sacred language sort of holding its structure, and that too all done through memorization. And I think that's the other important point that's sometimes hard for living people to appreciate, that the Zoroastrians of the past had absolutely phenomenal memory techniques, which we would love to know more about. And so also sometimes these ritual instructions give us a little clue as to how some of these things go together. I think there's another question. I think, Arzan, the next question is...
There is one from Kiersey, where Kiersey is asking, and this is to both the speakers, would it be fair to ask of the influence of your teachers or advisors mentioned here, Gellens and Scarvo? Both are great scholars, but are thought to be skeptical of the personage of Zarathustra. Is Kiersey's assumption correct?
I mean, regarding Gellens, I can say I think it is correct. So obviously, I have been influenced by my teacher. I also think that I have been quite lucky because I worked in Paris, then I worked in Liège, then I work in London, then now I am working in Strasbourg. And so I have been working with many people. I also worked with Alberto Contera, who has been very helpful when I was doing my PhD. And so I have been able, in fact, to take the best of each of them and build my own perception of things. And not trying to say, he said that, so I should agree, or he said that, so I should disagree. But I think that, of course, we are influenced. It's sure. But then we also move on and we do our own research, our own thoughts. And the question of Zarathustra is a very difficult one and will always be a difficult one, I would say. But
so
one.
Yeah. So I will be. So I think I would agree with everything that Céline says in general, but it doesn't apply to my story because
yours is different. So
mine is different because I was trained by Chervaux and trained by Chervaux. I mean, I didn't have in my postgraduate life, I didn't have as many influences as you've had. And I think the value of having multiple perspectives is just, it's immeasurable. So, but let me put it like this. I think when Kellens and Chervaux made these arguments in the 1990s, I think there was, and in some cases, very late 80s, early 90s, I think there was a lot of misunderstanding from community members, but I think also from scholars. And I don't want to lump them exactly together, but because they're not, they have slightly nuanced positions vis-a-vis each other. But I will say this. The point that they were making is that when the older scholars, including Gellner, Bartholomé, Henning, Mary Boyce, all the people from the past, what they saw all the later material written about, they looked at all the things written about Zarathustra or put in Zarathustra's voice in later sources, and they used those later materials to read into the Gathas the voice of a prophet. And in a sense, what Kellens and Chervaux were arguing for is that it's not good method to take something in classical Persian, let's say the story of Zarathustra, or in Pahlavi, and then retroject that back into the Avesta, find exactly what you already go looking for, and then say there's a continuity that kind of operates. Their basic point is a methodological one, is that there's a tautological aspect to this method, which is you take later material and then you find it in the past and then you say it's there, and therefore the later material is explained. So it becomes kind of circular. And I think both of their view has been that in order to really understand the Gathas, you really have to ditch a lot of this later material and try to see what are the Gathas doing in their own terms. Now, that being said, I think Kellens tends to read the Gathas with a very strong ritual focus, and Chervaux tends to read the Gathas with a very strong myth and ritual focus, in a very classical myth and ritual school approach. So and both of them were assistants and had worked with Humbach, who was the first one to largely sort of recoup the ritual approach to the material, which had been largely read biographically. So let me add a piece here. When Bartholomé first translated the Gathas, he basically saw the Gathas the 5 Gathas as sort of representing, loosely speaking, 5 stages in Zarathustra's life. That is, he's younger in Gatha 1 and he's marrying his daughter off in Gatha 5. So he obviously has to age, so to speak. Now, that is the exact type of approach that the two of them were critiquing. I mean, Humbach also made such critiques, of course, but their point is that we don't want to read biographically. That is, we want to read these materials on their own terms without, so, you say, oh, we know something about so-and-so author, they lived on so-and-so street in so-and-so time, and therefore that influence is to be found in that particular sentence. And that's really what their critique is. I don't think that their critique is really about trying to degrade a religion or eliminate a prophet or anything like that. That's really not what they're doing at all. It's really a methodological critique of their colleagues who are using the later Zoroastrian tradition in an ad hoc way to fill back the highly opaque sentences that they're trying to work out in the Gathas. I don't know whether, Céline, whether you would agree with my way of looking at this.
I think I would agree, and then it's also to show maybe the construction afterward, which has been done over centuries, and that you cannot see that in the old stage, and it's also that which has been put forward. But then it's for Kellens, I would say it's not really a matter to know if it's a true personage or not. What matters is what has been created, and this is the interest. And then you can put a name of Zarathustra on it or another name, but he's more interested in what is this religion at that point, and not necessarily who did it. Just because you have so less information in the text itself that it's very difficult to say something for him.
Yeah. You find Zarathustra's quote-unquote grand message in later materials, and then you find this highly opaque, extremely difficult to read material, and you just keep finding the message in there because you put it in there. And that, I think, is their critique of their colleagues. It's really that. I mean, that's the point, and I hope that sort of makes sense. I'll give you a small little example that might explain it. So in the Gathas, we have a reference to Yima, to Jamshid, and it has a sort of a negative connotation to it. So the assumption is that this is the same negative connotation that we find later in Persian material about Jamshid becoming arrogant and sort of having sort of a notion of hubris. And it may in fact be exactly that, but it's entirely possible it could be a different story in the past, and that the Persian version is a different angle. But how that's the methodological challenge. Like how do you find continuities, and how do you also find discontinuities? And the truth is that in all historical communities through time, you're going to get both things. So if you only look for continuities, you'll find them. And if you only look for discontinuities, you'll also find them. So that the artfulness...
It's a mix of both.
Yeah.
And it also depends on our sources. And it's difficult with the sources we have. We have plenty of sources, but not so much for each period. And then we build something based on these different sources. And so we need to be very cautious when we build something. What do we use to say that this has been said in the Gatha? Do we use our general knowledge, or do we use what we can see when we read the Gatha? And the Gatha are really obscure. And this is certainly why I didn't choose that path, because it's very difficult. Even Kellens, after 50 years working on the Gatha, is still not sure about everything. And he's still translating again and again and again.
And he's not sure of everything, and others aren't sure of what he's produced. So it's
exactly
for all of us. Yeah. So I think that goes nicely with the next question. So Arzan, should I read it, or do you want to? It's Artemis, I think.
Yeah, go ahead.
So it is true that there is more manuscripts on the rituals, but there is not enough research on the Gathas. Is it because of the difficulty of the old Persian language? So the short answer is that Gothic studies has a lot of work done, given how small the Gathas are. So we have, in the 20th century, there were 8 major philological translations produced in German, French, and English. The Zoroastrian community is mostly familiar with Insler because it was produced in English, though Insler's translation, to my view of the 8, is the most problematic. It changes the text radically in places from the act. I mean, he amends the text to make it more like Vedic because that's what he sees. And I think that's highly problematic. And Insler's translation is also the most Christianizing, and therefore the most easy to understand for modern people, because we're all in one form or the other in English influenced by Christianity. Whereas, for example, Humbach's translations, the 3 of them, or 4 of them, in German,
English,
German, English, German, German, English, but the translations were much more focused. Like his 1959 translation in German is much more focused on the ritual, whereas in the 1991 and others like becomes more about Zarathustra, the man, so to speak. So, in fact, there's a lot of work produced, and I think this is one of the unfortunate aspects of the international nature of the field, is that all of Kellenz's contributions to Gothic studies are largely unknown to Zoroastrians because it's primarily done, not exclusively, he does write in English, but mostly been done in French. And for example, the introduction that you did with him in French, if that was in English, I think it would bring a lot of new sort of people to read and sort of appreciate what the way that he sees this story. So, and the way that you see this story. And I think this is one of the classic historical challenges of the field, is that so much of our primary materials are in French and German. If you're working in archaeology, sometimes is in Russian. So much of the material produced by scholars in Iran in Persian is not really accessible either, or not well known. So there are a lot of challenges in that capacity.
Yeah, and with the Gatha, what is very difficult is that when you read something from nowadays, you need to know what has been done before, because they refer to something which has been published previously, but without explaining the full story. So if you don't know all the argument before, you may not understand what is written in 2022. And this is also the other difficulty. You have to read much more than one book to understand what is said. But there is quite a lot of the Gathas, and they disagree between them among specialists. So it also shows the difficulty of the text itself.
And it's worth saying that we don't, except for Insler, who changes the text, and so it's just a fundamental problem. The text that we work with, for the most part, is stable. We agree with what the words are.
Yeah.
Because remember, for every word, we have many, many manuscripts, and the manuscripts have different forms. But the text that for the Gathas that we have is far more stable than it is for some other parts of Avestan, where we're not quite sure what the actual word should be. The problem with the Gathas is working out what they mean, and what the forms might look like. Because it's worth saying, when you have the oldest source, but the source itself is alluding to a world of culture, ritual, myth, stories that existed before, your only choice is to do this kind of circular loop of going into the later material in Young Avestan, in Pahlavi, but sometimes, rarely, in Persian, and saying, oh, that's what this reference, this allusion could mean. But this is the fundamental problem of the study of the Gathas, is that if you find it in the later material, it's not proof that it's necessarily a long continuity, because occasionally you find multiple versions of the same story. So how do you know which one is the one that was actually being alluded to at the time of the composition? And we can see from the later Avestan material in the Pahlavi that the Zoroastrian scholars and the priests and the interpreters themselves had different interpretations of what those passages mean. And that's what I work on. So I work on Zoroastrian interpretation and what I call, what is technically called hermeneutics. And that's the great challenge of working on the Gathas, is that it's an interpretive problem. So the methodologies that you have are fundamentally important. And this is where, for example, Kellenz is such an important scholar, because Kellenz is so rigorous and methodological in how he operates reading the text, not just saying, oh, this exists in Persian, the story is there, therefore it must mean so and so, and then changing the grammar to make it fit for his purposes. That's something that he doesn't do. And I think that's that level of focus and rigor is not something that can be easily appreciated unless you can see what it's being done technically. And that's obviously the great challenge for the study of Zoroastrianism, that so much of what we do is technically hard to appreciate. You know, I mean, I read an article and I never agree with anyone 100%.
No, but it's part of the process.
Yeah, exactly. It's a process, and it's a process of creating consensus over time by saying, okay, this argument has been made. Can it be falsified? Well, it's falsifiable with this approach, but it's not falsifiable with that. Therefore, it may work, but some new piece of evidence comes and perhaps changes it. So that's really something that I think separates what we do in the academic study of Zoroastrianism from so many people who just go and basically take our translations and put them into a kind of idiom that is more accessible to the Zoroastrian public.
Yeah, but translation is just the last step of the full process, and many things happened in the meantime. And it's also true that sometimes people do not explain why they read this translation. So they just provide the translation. And it's sometimes the case of Kellens. It's not easy to follow everything if you do not work with him and speak with him aside. Same goes with Alberto Cantera's work at the moment. If you don't follow what is going on and you just read one of his articles, you are a little bit lost, I would say. But if you speak with the people, you have the full picture, and it's easier to build what has been done. On this, we have some work to do.
Yeah, and these are processes. I think it's worth saying that philology is not, it's not like 2 + 2 = 4. It's really a process of developing readings that are robust because they're not easily falsifiable. So that takes time because it requires us to look at a lot of material, a lot of manuscripts, for us to sort of look at various aspects, whether it's philosophy or ritual or myth, for us to look at linguistics, comparative linguistics. There's a lot of things that go into what we do. A classic example, and then we can end in a couple of minutes, but a classic example is, what do you do when you have an Avestan form and the meaning in comparison with Vedic suggests X, but when you find the same form in the way the Pahlavi scholars have understood it, the meaning is Y. So you can clearly see that the Vedic is so much closer in time period. It's almost contemporaneous with the Avestan. So the meaning should be relatively close. But it's a different tradition, which has evolved separately for ideological purposes. Whereas in the Zoroastrian tradition, in the Pahlavi, it's nominally the same tradition, but it's like 2,000 years away. So how do you manage that problem? That's a methodological problem, and different people approach it differently. I mean, I think Kellens and Schervo would even approach it differently. Céline and I may approach it differently in one example, and we may approach it exactly the same in another, because philology is not macro in that sense. You cannot create macro rules and apply. Every word has to be given its own, how do I put it? Its own story, its own genealogy, its own sanctity. Every single word has to be looked at on its own terms. So
I agree, and I think it depends also on what we do know, and what I know now might be different in a few days, because I will discover another text, I will read something else, and I will change my mind. So nothing is so fixed also. And I think we need to agree that we can change our mind, and that we may find something that will change our perception of a text. But yeah, there is still a lot to be done. So this is a good point.
I mean, there's an enormous work to be done. I'll just give you a small example from my own research. So I work on the Pahlavi interpretations of the Gathas. And I worked on a text that is around 5,600 words. 5,600 words is not all that big. It comes to about 25, 23, 24 pages of manuscript. It's not enormous.
No.
But It's not at all. But when I finished my project, which should be coming out in the next month or two, hopefully, fingers crossed, the text translation apparatus that was all the manuscript variants, introduction, bibliography, blah, 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 and a commentary, 2 volumes, that came to around 250,000 words. So you're looking at a ratio of 20 to 1. For every word of the original, I have produced 20 words to make sense of that original. So these things take a lot of time. So it's not something that can be done overnight. And it's worth saying that, there's a question here about why aren't there more people working on the Gathas in North America? Well, the short answer is that when I was a graduate student, there was Insler, there was Schervo, there was Schwartz. A lot of work was done in the Gathas in North America. And now the field has transitioned a little bit. So now we have people working in philology, in Miguel Ángel and Enrico Raffaelli, Miguel Andrés Toledo and Enrico Raffaelli in Toronto, and we have Adam Bencato at UC Berkeley, but then we also have Touraj Darioi and Rahim Shaigan, who are historians. So the field, in a way, is much more balanced now than it was in the past, where there were almost no historians other than Richard Fry. So fields move. There are very few of us. So it only takes 1 or 2 new hires who go in a particular direction for the disciplinary focus to shift. But it's not forever. And so if people are interested in the Gathas, what you have to do is raise the money for a professorship with that as its focus. And then you will have to recruit somebody who will have been taught by one of our teachers, because those were the people who worked on the Gathas. And so it's, it comes back to the earlier question that Kjersti raises about, how the influence of our teachers. None of us, I don't know any of us who are professional academics who've made it, who are just simple mimics of our teachers. Most of us have learned a lot from our teachers, but we also see the limits in what they did. But also, I think it's worth saying, it's not so much that we're better or worse than our teachers. It's that every era had different sets of questions responding to the generation earlier. And the questions we are asking now are responses to what was asked before. And then our students will ask different questions. So that's the nature of it. The challenge with the study of Zoroastrianism is you cannot have a 3,500-year tradition and have 25, 30 people do it. And that's the problem. It's just impossible. It's just impossible, or impossible to do it well. And so, we need many more positions, and in different time periods with different disciplines, with different, and over time, the richness of the field will grow with that. So, I think we should call it a day. I will say that Joseph Peterson does say that before he died, Dr. Insler told me he was working on a new translation of the Gathas. He had also told me that. Does anyone know what came of that project? And I must confess, I don't know. I don't know whether Céline would know. Do you?
No, I didn't even know Insler myself. So
Yeah.
I could ask Kellens if he knows about that, but he never told me something about it. So I don't know that. I think this is a main issue that we do face when someone is not there anymore, and what does happen with what he has done. And it is even worse nowadays, because at least before they used to do that by hand. And so you can go maybe to the house of the person and maybe you can find something. While nowadays it's on a computer. And so if you don't have access to the computer, everything can disappear. And this is, I think, a very important question. What happens when someone is not there anymore? And some maybe do something to prevent this, and some other less. I do know on my side that if Kellens does something, he always send it to me saying, if something happens to me, this is with you. So
Yes.
it doesn't mean I can do something with it, but I have the most current work he has done, and so nothing is really lost in case something happens. But touching wood, that nothing will happen, obviously.
Well,
so
it's true. I mean, what I do with my own work is I also have this anxiety. So what I do is every single time I work, I save a version in Dropbox, and I have an unnamed individual who has access to that Dropbox. So if I slip on a banana peel, that the latest version of whatever I've done would be found there. But I think this is an important point, and I think it's just one last small thing, and I think that we can end, is that this is a small example of just precisely how traditions survive and how traditions die. It's that is, you have to have, in order for things to survive generationally, you need both some form of fundamental conservatism, but you also need some kind of fundamental sense of progressivism. Otherwise, it doesn't work. You have to have both modalities need to be there. Otherwise, you either get something that gets completely ossified or something that loses all its fundamental sort of essence, if you could say that. So,
okay. So I think with this we'll come to an end. I think it's always the quality of the talk is always measured by the number of questions that come up and get left unanswered, because we are running against the clock. So this was a really fun talk, and we really went 1 hour and 45 minutes. So thank you, Céline and Yuhan, for a very, very engaging talk, and thank you to all of the people who participated and went back and forth. I know there was one question. If people want to get in touch with both of you, can you put your email addresses in the chat so that Céline and Yuhan, so that people can reach out? And with that, I know Yuhan announced that the next talk will be on Saturday, December 2nd, and basically that will complete season 1 and basically the talks for this year, 2023. December 2nd, we'll have Mariano, who just recently started at SOAS, and he will be in conversation with Yuhan. That's the Saturday after Thanksgiving for those of us in United States. You'll get enough updates on that, so don't worry. We'll keep you posted. And thank you once again, Céline and Yuhan.
Yeah, and Mariano, I know Mariano's on there, so perhaps just turn your video on and say hello.
Yeah, I will have to. Yeah, where is Mariano? Is he here?
Yeah, he should be. Or at least I see his name.
There he is. Hi, Mariano. Yep.
Hello, can you see me?
Yes.
Yes.
How are you?
Good.
Right. So
Nice
we are now,
I look forward to the 2nd of December.
So we are now truly in Netflix style, right? Where we're saying coming up, episode 4, and here's a small trailer.
No, and I think it's what's nice about this is that both Céline and Mariano are the newest people to get sort of permanent jobs, so they can really build a legacy of what they work on. And Céline works on sort of the deep, long philological history, and Mariano works on the ethnographic lived realities of people in the contemporary. So I think it's I'm very happy that the two of you sort of go one after the other, because in a way it shows that this field is something much more capacious than simply only the modern or only the past or only the sort of pre-modern or the past. So
Thank you very much.
We will do our best.
Absolutely.
Brilliant.
So thank you all for joining. Have a happy rest of the weekend, and see you all soon. Take care.
thank you very much. Have a nice day.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
It was wonderful.